Hey everyone, it's Monday, March 23rd. Want to give an update on how I'm sort of thinking about this and how our team has sort of shifted our focus a little bit. I sort of had an epiphany on Friday that I'm a little surprised it took so long to realize, which was, we've been trying to think about this through the lens of United States versus Italy versus China versus Singapore, what's going to happen here, et cetera. That's the wrong way to think about it. I think the right way to think about it is by metro area. And so the analogy, and maybe it's because everything in my life comes down to cars, is each city in the US is basically a car driving towards a cliff. Now, there are different size cars, and the cars are driving at different speeds, and the cars have applied the brakes at different periods of time. They also have different tire qualities, and to make matters more complicated, they're all on slightly different surfaces. Some of them are on concrete, some of them are on gravel. You can sort of imagine what's going on here, right? What's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is a car that has a lot of people on it, therefore it's a heavier car, traveling very fast on lousy tires on a lousy surface that waits until very, short distance between the end of the cliff to apply the brakes. Conversely, there are cars that don't have that many people in it. They're relatively light. They're not even traveling that quickly. They apply the brakes, maybe even softly, but they do so well before they get to the edge of the cliff, it's not going to be an issue. When you try to blend all of those together, which is sort of what we've been doing, you miss the point. And so the point now is pretty clearly that even when you look at Italy, you can't look at Italy as one country. So, one of my analysts pulled some of these numbers this morning at my ask, and just, I'm surprised I didn't notice this before, right? So in Milan, 2175 deaths at a population of 10 million. I'm not even going to get into infection rate right now. We'll come back to that, but just, 2,200 deaths on a population of 10 million people. In the region around Rome, 31 deaths in a population of 6 million. Sicily, 3 deaths in a population of 5 million. So between Milan and Rome, that's a 40x difference in mortality, same country, right? Between Milan and Sicily, over 300x difference. So we talk about Italy like it's one country. It's not one country, right? I mean, for the purpose of the coronavirus, it's really about which part of the country got a head start, meaning accelerated first, and then was, relatively speaking, later to put on the brakes given their speed. Okay, so how does all this translate to what's going on in the United States? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist at this point to realize that of all the cars, New York is the one we're most worried about. Why? Because New York has, in some ways, the biggest head start. So it started driving towards the cliff first. It also is a very big car and has a lot of people on it, and therefore it's going really fast because the rate at which people have been transmitting this virus to each other is very high, given the proximity they are to each other versus, say, Madison, Wisconsin. So we've got more models than I can shake a stick at, and people have been amazing coming out of the woodworks to help us, sending us their models, letting us poke holes in them, send them back to them saying, hey, your model doesn't make sense. Can you modify it this way, that way? The other thing, we've looked at this 10 ways to Sunday, and I think for the purpose of time, I'm just going to kind of give you our summary. There are basically about 1,000 ICU beds in New York City. Now, you can repurpose a bunch more, right? So you can take the surgical ICUs, the pediatric ICUs, the neuro ICUs, and you can repurpose them for medical pulmonary ICUs by cutting down on elective cases and things like that. But you'll never fully empty them. So keep in mind that, you'll still probably have a census of non-COVID patients that's like 25% of your ICU beds. So let's assume you can get that number of COVID-ready ICU beds up to 1,500, maybe 2,000. The question then becomes, will the rate of people who are infected that are going to require ICU care over the coming weeks overwhelm that number? And unfortunately, every way I look at this, the answer is yes. It basically comes down to the following arguments, which then get fed into a model. On Friday, we knew that there were approximately 150 ICU cases in New York. Yesterday morning, we believe that was somewhere between 300 and 330. Last night, we think it's 450. And I think today, the last numbers I've seen, which are of about 3 hours ago, 621 patients in an ICU in New York. So you can sort of look at that growth rate, and that's obviously pretty troubling. The question becomes, what would be the best case scenario in New York? Okay, the best case scenario in New York is effective now, not one new person is getting infected. That means R naught, which is the rate of infection, goes to 0. So we've taken enough measures that everybody gets it, social distancing to the max, nobody is infecting anybody. Now, that's not possible yet, but that's the best case scenario. And therefore, you're only dealing with how many people are going to be requiring hospitalization of those that are currently infected. And this simplifies the math to show you what you have to believe best case scenario. In our calculations, which I've seen lots of other people replicate this with more or less conservative estimates, it kind of comes down to the following belief. You have to believe that we are only underestimating the number of infected cases, and we know there are about 12,000 documented infections in New York City. You have to believe that that only underrepresents the total number of infections by about 3x, maybe 4x. And you have to believe that no more than 3.5% of those people will require an ICU, and that nobody new is getting infected. Now, what do we know so far? Well, we know that in Italy, the ICU rate of infected people was 4.7 to 4.8%. Haven't found those numbers for Korea yet, but I'm going to assume that they were better. If anybody has them, please respond to this as much. In New York so far, I think we're at 4.9 to 5% infection to ICU rate. And I think that's a more important metric than infection to hospitalization rate. So in summary, for New York to not be overwhelmed, the following has to be directionally correct. One, people can't be getting infected anymore. That means nobody is out there in contact or in proximity to anybody else, because even if you're asymptomatic, you can be transmitting. Two, the number of actual cases to the number of known cases has to be less than about 3 or 4 to 1. And three, fewer than about 4% of those patients are going to need to require ICU care. Do I believe that those conditions are true? I don't. And therefore, I think that New York should be, and I think is starting to make steps to dramatically increase that capacity. For what it's worth, my personal view is if you're in New York, if you're at risk and you have another place to be and you can get there safely, that's probably another viable option here, because if God forbid you do get sick 2 weeks from now, I'm just not sure what the hospital system looks like. Again, I would love to be wrong on this, but with respect to New York, I've spent 48 hours, nonstop, including in my dreams, literally dreaming about this, trying to come up with a way for this not to be the case, and I can't do it. The good news is there's no other city that I see in as dire a situation right now. And that means if you're watching this and you're not in New York City, it's not the time to be smoking and joking. It's the time to be continuing to push hard on those brakes to make sure you don't get too close to the cliff's edge, which means stop the rate of transmission, even though that comes at a great cost in the short term. And hopefully the medical system standing by doing the same sort of calculation. I do think California is on the fence, both northern and southern. I actually think Washington State looks better than I thought a few days ago, and I think in part that's because some of the early mortality was clustered around one demographic that might not represent the true rate of infection. I think parts of Florida also need to be very careful. I wish I had more time to do this for every city. I don't. Obviously, right now, the highest priority is sort of understanding what people in New York can do. So anyway, I hope this provided a little bit of clarity about how I'm thinking about it and how different cities can be in different predicaments. Again, just think of a whole bunch of cars with different numbers of people moving at different speeds on different road surfaces with different tire qualities. applying the brakes at different periods of time. It looks totally different. And to ask the question, are the cars safe or not safe is the wrong question. Ask it on a car by car basis.